There is a thing the Nalith do when a consort dies. They light a fire in the outer court, a low, slow burn of cedar oil and ground silver root, and they let it run for 3 days and 3 nights. And then on the 4th morning, the queen stands at the edge of the ash and formally releases the name. Not from memory, from record. The household archivist removes the consort's name from the living rolls of House Nalith, moves it to the memorial column, and the queen never speaks it in the present tense again. I know this because I was supposed to be that fire. I was supposed to be that ash. 6 years ago, the patrol cruiser Erith broke apart over the outer edge of the Veth system, and the rescue mission found 11 of the 14 crew and no bodies for the other 3. I was one of the 3. The official record said, Consort Jor-El Marin of House Nalith, human male, age 37, crew designate secondary, killed in the Erith breach. That record was filed by the court archivist. That record was voted on, in a solemn closed session, by the Queen's Senior Advisory Council. Queen Saraveth of House Nalith refused to light the fire. She refused once, formally, in open council in language I was told about later. She refused the second time, when the council brought it back to her 3 months after the breach. After the official investigation closed, after every salvage team had returned empty, she refused a 3rd time when the outer court advisor, a man named Seth Halal, precise and cold, who had never approved of me in the first place, presented her with the names of 7 eligible Nalith-blooded men the succession council had quietly assembled, men who could serve as consort, men who would not carry the liability of being the only human male in the Nalith royal line. She refused him. She told him, according to the account I eventually received from the household steward, that she had not lit the fire and she did not intend to light it, and that if the succession council wished to arrange something for the realm's benefit, she was willing to hear their proposals. But she was not willing to move Jor-El Marin's name to the memorial column, because she did not believe he was dead. She said she would know. She said that was not something she required proof for. She would know, the way you know the temperature of a room you are standing in, the way you know your own heartbeat in a quiet moment, without evidence, without ceremony, without a body. The council thought she was grieving badly. They were patient with her. The way you are patient with someone who cannot accept a hard thing. She was right, and I was in a labor compound on a moon called Drevet 6, and I would not know for almost 3 more years that she had refused the fire. I need to tell you what 6 years in a Drevet 6 labor compound does to a man, because it matters for later. It is not dramatic. There are no torturers, no heroic escapes, no moment where I stare defiantly at a captor and declare my name. The compound at Drevet 6 was run by a holding company registered out of the outer Veth territories. Technically legal, technically under Galactic Labor Code, and the people running it were not cruel so much as indifferent. You worked, you ate, you slept, you worked again. The pay was issued in credit slips that were only redeemable at the compound commissary, which meant you could not save enough to buy passage out, which was by design. You were not a prisoner. You were simply, mathematically, unable to leave. The work was ore processing, loading, sorting, calibrating the extraction conveyors, doing the maintenance tasks that were technically supposed to be done by specialist equipment, but were cheaper done by the hands of people whose labor contracts had already been paid for. The shifts ran 12 hours, optionally 14 when the throughput quota was behind. On the days the quota was far enough behind, they ran 16, and you ate standing at the line rather than in the meal hall, and you slept on your feet between cycles. I had been a soldier. I had been a soldier for 15 years before I became a royal consort, and those 15 years had given me a relationship with my own body that was practical rather than precious. I knew how much I could take, and I knew how to take more than I thought I could. That helped in the early years. What I had not been prepared for was the quality of the boredom, particular grinding absence of purpose that sets in when you are doing work that has no meaning beyond its metric, no outcome that matters to anyone, including yourself. Day after day, until the metrics blur into each other, and the only thing distinguishing Tuesday from Wednesday is which section of the conveyor you were assigned to. Developed habits. Lists, as I said, at night in the bunk going over the things I still knew. Name first. then my record number, then the layout of the outer court at Nalith Prime. Then the names of every person I had served with in my 15 years of service, starting from the first posting. I did not always finish the list before I slept. Finishing was not the point. The point was the practice. The deliberate act of remembering, of keeping the things I knew alive in the absence of anything that confirmed they were real. I had been pulled from the wreckage of the Erith Solon by a salvage trawler. A small two-man operation, barely legal, working the breach debris field for recoverable materials. The two men who found me were not interested in reporting a survivor to the authorities because reporting a survivor meant paperwork, and paperwork meant their own salvage operation would be scrutinized. And they were not particularly interested in scrutiny, so they did not report me. They sold my labor contract to a resourcing broker, and the broker placed me at Drevet 6, and that was where I spent the next 6 years of my life. I am not asking for sympathy. I am trying to be accurate about what I looked like when the rescue team found me, because it matters. I was 43. I had gone in at 37, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that still had angles and relative youth in it. I came out of Drevet 6 with gray at the temples, and through the beard I had grown, because the compound barber charged credit slips I couldn't spare. I came out with a scar running from my left ear to just below my jaw from a piece of falling ceiling strut in the ore processing shed. I came out 20 pounds lighter than I went in, and with calluses on my hands thick enough that I could not feel temperature in the tips of my first 2 fingers on the right hand. I came out with a way of walking that a young medic on the rescue team would later describe, diplomatically, as deliberate, meaning I moved like a man who had learned not to move quickly unless he meant it. The rescue team was not looking for me specifically. They were doing a labor compound audit sweep under a new enforcement provision the Outer Veth Cooperative had finally agreed to, after a decade of lobbying, and Drevet 6 was on the list. They found 41 people whose contracts were flagged as irregular, and I was one of the 41. It was a caseworker, a young Nalith female with dark copper skin, and the very tired eyes of someone who had been doing this work for years, who looked at my intake record, looked at the name, and went very still. She left the processing tent. She came back with her supervisor. They asked me to confirm my name. I told them my name. They asked me for my identifying record number, which is a thing every registered person in the Nalith territories has, SIS, and which I could recite in my sleep because there had been hours in Drevet 6, when there was nothing to do at night but lie on a cot and go over the list of things I still knew. And my record number was always first on the list. I gave it to them. The caseworker's supervisor left the tent for a longer time. He came back. She was carrying a comms unit, and she looked at me the way you look at something that should not be possible. She said, "Consort Marin, I need you to understand that the House of Nalith has listed you as deceased for 5 years and 4 months. I said I understood, she said. The Queen has not formally recognized that status. She has not lit the Mourning fire. I sat with that for a moment. The tent smelled like the compound, ore dust and the particular cold of a moon with too thin an atmosphere. The light was the flat white of portable lamps. I said, no, she wouldn't. That was all I said about it right then. I couldn't say more. I am going to tell you that I am not a man who cries easily, not from years of practice suppressing it, not from pride, but simply because that has always been my nature. The way some people run warm and some run cool. But I sat in that tent on Drevet 6 with 41 other people in irregular labor contracts around me and the caseworker's supervisor watching me with careful professional eyes. And my eyes were wet. I wiped them with the back of my hand. The calluses caught on my cheekbone. She hadn't lit the fire. The supervisor asked if I needed a moment. I told her no. She asked if I was prepared for the comms process. Meaning, did I understand that there were official channels, that they would need to verify my identity with House Nalith directly, that the process could take some time, that I should not expect immediate contact. Told her I understood. They verified my identity in 4 hours. I don't know what that verification looked like on the other end. I have since been told that the caseworker's supervisors sent the report through the standard labor enforcement channel, and that someone in the outer court received it and that the entire advisory council was convened within 40 minutes of that report arriving, which is not how advisory councils usually convene. Someone had carried it directly to the Queen. I was on Drevet 6 for another 48 hours while transport was arranged. The caseworker, her name was Avith, and she had the kind of competent quiet that I had noticed in the best people I had ever worked alongside, brought me a meal that was not compound food, real food from the rescue team's own provisions. She didn't say anything particular about it. She set it in front of me and went back to her work, and I ate it slowly because my stomach had learned not to trust abundance. On the second night, she came and sat across from me in the processing tent after most of the others had been moved to the transport hold. She said carefully, "Is there anything you want to know about the intervening period? I can pull publicly available records if that would help you prepare." I thought about it. I said, "Did she?" And then I stopped because I was not sure what I was asking. Did she manage? Did she hold the court together? Did she stay as she was? Avith said, "She has held the court." There were some difficult years in the middle. The Succession Council made several attempts that she refused. She is considered formally in an unusual political situation. House Naleth's position in the cooperative has not declined. The assessments I have seen suggest she is. A pause. They suggest she handled it with characteristic composure. I said, "That sounds right." Avith said, "The council was not kind to her through most of it. I think you should know that. They were not cruel, but they were persistent. And some of the formal proposals they brought they were not respectful of her position. She refused all of them, several times in language that was reportedly quite direct." I said, "That also sounds right." We sat in the tent for another few minutes, the compound, outside going through its night cycle. Low lights, distant hum of the ore processors that ran continuously. Then Avith said, "I've been doing this work for 11 years. I have found people who were lost. It doesn't always. The reunion is not always what people hope. Sometimes too much time has passed, or too much has changed." She was not being cruel. She was doing what a careful person does when they see a situation that could break badly. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that she said." I said, "She didn't light the fire." Avith was quiet. I said, "I know her. I've known her for 14 years. She did not light the fire. She doesn't do things she doesn't mean." Avith nodded slowly. She did not look entirely convinced, but she stopped trying to prepare me. Later, much later, she would tell me she had been wrong to try. The transport was a mid-range frigate called the Cyril Kind, 4 days from Drevet 6 to the inner Naleth territorial border, and another 2 days from there to the station dock at Naleth Prime. I had a bunk in the crew quarters, and access to the common room, and the observation deck, and I spent a great deal of time on the observation deck, because the windows were large, and the view was the kind that reminded you that the universe continued to exist, regardless of what happened inside it, which was a thing I had needed reminding of during certain periods on Drevet 6, and still needed now. The stars outside the observation windows were not the stars I had watched from Drevet 6. The compound moon had a heavy mineral haze that made the sky look like a smeared charcoal drawing. These were real stars, clear and cold and very far away, and I sat with them for hours on the first night out of Drevet 6, just looking, just learning to accept that they were there. There was a young crew member who worked the overnight observation deck shift, a Naleth male, mid-20s, with the loose-limbed ease of someone who has grown up in low-gravity environments. He was polite without being intrusive. On the second night, he brought me a container of the tea the Naleth call Velsoth, which is a warm amber drink made from a root I cannot identify by sight, and he set it next to me without comment and went back to his monitoring station. I drank the Velsoth and looked at the stars and thought about what 6 years meant. Not about what I had missed, not yet. That would come later, in a long and sometimes painful accounting. What I was thinking about, out there on the observation deck with the stars going past and the tea warm in my hands, was what she had done with those 6 years. Not political record, not the Succession Council battles, the texture of it. The way she had woken up every morning in a house that had her husband's name in the living rolls, even though the court said he was dead, and gone through the formal hours of queenship, the hearings, the deliberations, The management of a house and a territorial position in a cooperative that was never entirely comfortable with a human consort in the first place. And then, gone to sleep again, and woken up again, and continued to refuse to say the word that would make it official. That was a specific kind of faith. I had known she was stubborn. I had married her partly because of it. There is a kind of stubbornness that is also integrity, that is also a refusal to agree to things you don't believe just because the pressure to agree is very great. And that was the kind she had. 6 years is a long time to hold something you cannot prove. 6 years is a long time to sit in advisory councils and listen to careful, authoritative voices explain to you why you should let go, and to look at them and say no. On the third day out of Drevet 6, the ship received a formal acknowledgement from House Naleth. The captain, a compact, efficient woman named Relsoven, brought it to me personally. It was short. It confirmed receipt of the verification and indicated that House Naleth would arrange formal reception at Naleth Prime Station. It was signed with Sarah Veth's full house signature, which is a long formal string of titles and designations that takes up 3 lines of text. At the bottom, below all the formal apparatus, was one additional line that was not part of the official format. It said, in her handwriting, I recognized it from the angle of the letters, from the particular way she formed the lowercase h that she had always made slightly differently from the standard script. It said, I have kept everything as it was. That was all. 4 words after all the formal text. Captain Relsoven was watching me read it. She was Naleth-born, older than me by a decade or so, and she had the expression of someone who has seen things in the course of their work that have revised their assumptions about what people are capable of. She said, she wrote that part herself. It was not in the draft her court secretary prepared, I said. I know, she said. My family is from the outer Naleth territories. We followed the situation, the council's handling of it. A pause. She is a very particular sort of person, the Queen, I said. Yes. The captain nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. She left me with the letter. I kept it. I folded it, and put it in the breast pocket of the jacket the rescue team had given me, and I left it there for the rest of the journey. And I did not take it out again, but I was aware of it the entire time. The way you are aware of something that is both very small and very consequential. The last night before Naleth Prime, I went back to the observation deck. The stars were different here. Closer to the inner territories, you could see the particular density of light that meant inhabited systems, the slow background warmth of a region where people had been living for a long time. The young crew member was at his station again. He looked at me once, nodded, and did not bring tea this time. He seemed to understand that tonight was not a Velsoth night. I stood at the window for a long time. I had been running a different kind of list on the Serral kind than the lists I had run at Drevet 6. Not the catalogue of remembered facts. I had the facts now. The world was full of confirmable facts again. I didn't need to hold them by force of will. What I had been running instead was something harder to name. A kind of accounting of what I had become, or what the 6 years had made of me, held against the question of what I was going back to. There is a thing people who have been away from their lives for a long time sometimes do, which is they convince themselves that return will restore the person they were before. That if they can just get home, get back to the rooms, and the faces and the rhythms they remember, the person who walked away will reappear. I did not think I was doing this, but I had been checking myself against it. The gray in my hair was not going to leave. Scar was not going to heal further. The deliberate way I moved now, the particular economy of my gestures, the quality of patience I had developed. Patience not as virtue but as pure survival adaptation, the ability to wait without deteriorating. These were mine now. They were not the man who had stepped onto the Aerith Solon. But they were not bad things either. They were what the years had left. I thought about the scar on my jaw and the gray in my hair, and the way I walked now, deliberate and careful, the way the calluses on my hands had changed the shape of my grip. I was not the same man who had stepped onto the Aerith Solon 6 years ago. I was not certain what I was now, not in the way of doubt or grief, but in the way of genuine open accounting. I had come through something. I had been remade by it in ways I was still understanding. I thought about what it would mean to walk back into her court, to stand in front of a woman who had spent 6 years defending the idea of my existence against a council that had very good evidentiary reasons for declaring me dead. To be the proof she had been right, I thought about what I would say. I did not have anything prepared. I never do, for the things that matter. I have learned that prepared words for the things that matter ring wrong, like a note played in the wrong key. Technically correct and somehow hollow. When it came to it, I would say what I said. Be enough, or it wouldn't. And if it wasn't enough, then we would work from there. The way you work from wherever you actually are, instead of wherever you plan to be. But I did not believe it wouldn't be enough. She had kept everything as it was. I kept the Stars Company until the young crew member's shift ended, and a quiet woman with silver-threaded hair came to relieve him. And then I went to my bunk and I slept properly for the first time since Drevet 6, which is to say, I slept without one ear still listening for the shift change bell in the compound. Without the particular tension in my shoulders that 6 years of sleeping in a room with 40 other men had installed. I slept until the dock alert sounded at 0600, and I woke up and lay still for a moment, looking at the bunk ceiling and thought, today, they had given me clean clothes before Naleth Prime. The rescue team had a standard kit for situations like this, practical and decent if not ceremonial. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, a jacket in the cooperative's neutral transit gray. I stood in the small head and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in a long time. The compound had mirrors in the washroom, but I had stopped looking closely at them years ago. Became a habit. You look at what you need to look at and you move on. I looked now. The scar was silver at the edges, fully healed, curving from behind my left ear to below my jaw. The gray in my hair was more than I had realized. It had been coming in for years, and now it was through the dark completely at the temples, and shot through the rest. The beard was shorter than compound length, trimmed by the rescue team medic. I looked, as I said, like a man in his mid-40s who had spent some years doing hard physical labor and sleeping badly. I thought about what she would see. I thought about the 14 years before Drevet 6, the early years of a pairing that the Naleth court had regarded with everything from polite skepticism to open opposition. A human male in the royal household of a Naleth queen, which was unprecedented and had remained unprecedented through all the years we were together. I thought about how she had handled that opposition, steadily, without drama, with the particular quality she had of simply not arguing about things she had already decided. She would hear the argument, she would acknowledge its logic, and she would proceed as she intended. I thought about the morning we stood in the outer court, a cold morning, very early, before the formal day had started, and she had told me, in the direct way she had that was never harsh but was always precise, that she had not made this decision without understanding what it would cost, and she did not regret the cost, and she wanted me to understand that. I had told her I understood. She had looked at me for a long moment, with those pale gray eyes, the color of deep sky haze, assessing whether I actually understood, or was just saying I did. Then she had said, "Good," and gone inside to prepare for the morning council session. 6 years. She had kept everything as it was. The docking bay at Naleth Prime was one of the larger inner system stations, a permanent structure, rather than a transit terminal, and it had been arranged. I learned from Captain Relsoven, who briefed me quietly before disembarkation, that the formal reception would happen in the inner bay rather than the public docking floor. Not because it was secret, she said. The household had released a brief official statement. Consort Marin confirmed living, returning to Naleth Prime for formal re-entry to the household roles. And the public record had been updated, and the advisory council had been formally notified. The Queen had requested that the first meeting be in the inner bay, rather than a ceremonial reception hall, and the council had agreed without much visible objection, which Relsoven seemed to find notable. I asked her why she thought they agreed. She said, "I think they have been watching her hold this position for 6 years. And they understand now that arguing with her about the terms of this particular thing is an argument they will not win." The inner bay was a room of polished dark stone. Naleth always builds in that stone, a deep gray-green material quarried from the inner moon, present in every formal space of any Naleth house of standing. It had high windows that let in the particular quality of Naleth Prime light, which is cooler and more blue-white than standard, and the floor had been swept clean and was empty of the usual dock equipment. There were a few people along the far wall, court staff, two of the household guard in their formal copper and dark green, and the steward I recognized, an older man named Vel Sothran, who had been Sarah Veth's household steward for as long as I had known her, and who was looking at me now from across the room with an expression I could not read except that it involved a considerable effort of control. I walked through the inner bay door. My footsteps were loud on the stone. She was standing at the center of the room, not at the far wall with the court staff, not behind a desk or dais. At the center, alone, in the formal day dress of a Naelith queen at home, deep green, fitted to the shoulder, the copper thread housemark at the collar, and she was standing very still, the way she stands when she has decided something and is waiting for the world to catch up to her decision. I stopped about 10 feet away. She looked at me. I have been trying for a long time to find language for what that moment was. I do not mean that in an elevated way. I mean it very practically. The way a person who tends toward plain speech finds themselves standing in front of a thing that plain speech does not quite capture. She looked at me, and the look was not shock exactly. It was not the wide-eyed disbelief of someone who has been surprised. It was something quieter and deeper than that. It was the look of someone who has been holding a very specific faith for a very long time, and is now seeing that faith confirmed in the most ordinary and concrete way possible, which is the hardest confirmation to receive, because it makes all the years of holding suddenly very present. Her eyes were the gray I remembered, pale gray, deep sky haze gray, the color that I had spent the early years of knowing her trying to find the right word for. They were wet, not streaming, not overflowing, just the particular brightness that means the wetness is there and being held. I said, "Hello, Sarah." That was what I had. That was all I had. "Hello, Sarah." 4 years on Drevet 6, I had imagined this moment in different forms, in different versions, and in none of them had I imagined that what I would say was hello. But it was what came out, in the plainest voice I had, and I think it was right, because it was the most ordinary thing. Not a proclamation, not an apology, not a speech. Just the way you greet the person you have been away from for a long time, the same way you would greet them if you had only been away for an afternoon. 2 steps toward me. Then she stopped. She looked at my face, the scar, the gray, the particular set that years in a labor compound puts in a person's expression. She was doing the accounting that I had done in the mirror that morning, taking the inventory of what 6 years had made. Then she said, "You look thin." Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, low and precise. The kind of voice that says exactly what it means. I said, "I've been told." She said, "Are you well?" I said, "I'm here." She came the rest of the way across the room. She stopped an arm's length from me, looking up. She has always been shorter than me, though she carries herself as if the difference in height is a minor administrative detail that doesn't particularly apply to her. And she put her hand against my jaw on the right side, away from the scar. The way you touch something to confirm it is real. Hand was cool. The calluses on my fingers meant I couldn't feel the full texture of her palm, but I could feel the shape of it, the weight of it. And that was enough, she said. "I told them you weren't dead," I said. "I know," she said. "They were quite persistent about it," I said. "Avith, the caseworker who found me, she mentioned you'd had some trouble with the council." Something moved across her face that might have been the ghost of dry amusement. She said, "Seth Halal brought me a formal proposal 11 months in. He had consulted 3 separate bereavement protocol specialists." A pause. "I told him what I thought of it," I said. "Was it diplomatic?" She said, "No." I laughed. It was a short sound, rougher than laughter used to be in my throat. The compound was dusty, and the dust had done something permanent to my voice register. But it was real. And at the sound of it, something in her face changed. She said, "The second proposal was more formal. Brought the full succession council, 11 members, plus 2 of the outer court advisors. They had a prepared document. It was quite thorough." She paused. They had researched the precedents. There are 6 cases in the last 3 centuries where a Naelith queen had lost a consort and been formally persuaded to accept a successor pairing. They presented all 6. "Commentary," I said. "What did you say to 11 people with a prepared document?" she said. I read it thoroughly, which I think surprised them. They expected me to refuse immediately. I read it, and then I asked them to identify, in any of the 6 cases, one instance where the consort had been confirmed dead rather than simply unrecovered. She was watching my face. There was not one. All 6 cases involved confirmed deaths. Aerith Solon had no confirmed death for me. The case for formal status change rested entirely on presumption. A pause. Seth Halal argued that the standard of evidence for presumptive death in maritime and void travel law was well established. I told him that the standard of evidence was established for cases where the affected party had no basis for belief to the contrary, and that I had such a basis, and that it was not subject to evidentiary review. I said, they must have loved that. She Seth Halal, my basis for belief was sentiment rather than evidence. He said it with considerable delicacy. Her expression was level and dry. I told him that the distinction he was drawing between sentiment and evidence assumed that the person making the assessment had no relevant information and was proceeding on emotion alone, and that this assumption was incorrect, and that the conversation was concluded. I looked at her, 14 years and 6 absent, and she had stood in a council chamber with 11 people and out-argued them on procedural grounds, while the actual reason she refused was something that could not be put into a document at all, because she would have known. Because that was not sentiment. It was something older and plainer than sentiment. Something that did not require justification the way evidence requires justification. She had known, and she had been right. And she had defended it anyway with every formal tool available to her, not because she needed the formal tools, but because she understood that the only way to protect an unverifiable certainty in a formal setting is to make it structurally impregnable. The careful composure she had been maintaining since I walked into the inner bay shifted, and what was underneath was not grief and not relief exactly. It was something I recognized because I had seen it once before, very early before we were married. The look of someone who has been holding something at enormous cost and is now, carefully, setting it down. She did not cry. That is also true to her. She would not have in this room, with the court staff along the wall. She held what she was feeling, the way she always holds things, with a steadiness that I'd spent 14 years admiring and, occasionally, finding maddening. But her hand was still against my jaw, and she did not move it. I put my hand over hers. The calluses made it clumsy. She did not seem to mind. Behind us at the wall, I was dimly aware of the sound of Vel Sothran, the old steward, clearing his throat once. It was not a pointed sound. It was the sound of a man who has been carrying something for a long time, and is quietly, privately putting it down. The court staff remained where they were. No one spoke. The light through the high windows was the cool blue-white of Nalith Prime, falling on the dark green stone floor, and the room was very still. She said quietly, "For me alone, your name is still on the living rolls." I said, "I know." She said, "It was never moved." I said, "I know, Sarah." She said, 6 years and 4 months. "Counted," I said. "I know you did." This was the accounting I understood. Not an apology, not an explanation. Telling me what she had held, and for how long, because she needed me to know it accurately, in the way she always needs things to be accurately understood. Not embellished, not minimized. 6 years and 4 months. She had counted, I said. I kept a list of things I still knew. At night, when there was nothing else, your name was always first. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What else was on the list?" I said, "Your voice, the temperature of the outer court in the morning, the way the Velsoth smells when it's brewed properly, the house mark at the collar of your formal dress." I paused. "The way you look at a thing when you've decided about it and are waiting for everyone else to catch up." She was looking at me that way right now, she said. "You are thinner than you should be," I said. "The food at Drevet 6 was practical rather than generous," she said. "The household kitchens will address that, and then precisely, with the same tone she would use for any household administrative matter. You'll need to be seen by the house medic today, tonight at the latest." She said, "and the court will need a formal session. Tomorrow at the earliest. The re-entry to the living rolls is a simple procedure, but the council will want to be formally convened for it. And Seth Halal will want to conduct it, in a way that allows him to reframe the last 6 years of his own record. I said, let him. She looked at me with the pale gray eyes. He was doing what he thought was right for the house. He was wrong, but he wasn't malicious. Let him reframe it however he needs to. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, you're more generous than I am, I said. You held the house together for 6 years alone. You're allowed to be ungenerous. Something crossed her face again. That ghost of a thing that was almost a smile and almost not, that I had learned to read over years as one of her forms of genuine feeling. She said, I was not alone. Velsothran was here. From the wall, the old steward said with great dignity. I tried. I looked over at him. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been through something considerable and has come out the other side of it and is grateful to be there. I said, thank you for staying with her. He said it was not a sacrifice, it was the correct thing. He paused. Come home, Consort Marin. The title landed differently in this room, in this light, after 6 years of no title at all. I am not a man who is moved by titles in the ordinary way. I was always aware that I carried Saraveth's house designation rather than anything that was intrinsically mine, and I was at peace with that, because it was honestly true, and honest accounting is what I am built for. But the title from Velsothran, in that room, was not about rank. It was about the fact that the word home was accurate, and that accuracy had been defended for 6 years and 4 months, and that the defense had held. Thank you, Velsothran. He nodded once. He did not trust himself to say more, I thought. Saraveth's hand was still against my jaw. She turned back to look at me, and the accounting in her eyes was not finished. It would not be finished in a day, or a week, or probably a month. The full accounting of what those years had been, and what it meant to have them behind us now. But there was something settled in her expression that I had not seen there in the moments after I walked in. Something that had been held tight for a long time, and was beginning, carefully, to ease. She said, the outer court fire. They asked me to light it 5 times. I said, I heard it was 3. She said, the official record says 3. The actual number is 5. The last 2 times were informal. Seth Halal and a single court secretary on a very gray afternoon in the 3rd year, with a very small fire and a great deal of respectful pressure. I said, what did you tell him? She said, I told him the fire was inappropriate and he should send the court secretary home. I said, and did he? She said, eventually. We stood there in the blue-white light of the inner bay for another moment. Behind us, the court staff was quiet. The guard at the far door had not moved. The room smelled of the gray-green stone. A mineral, cool scent, clean, and underneath it something I had not registered for 6 years. The particular ambient scent of a Nalith formal house, cedar oil, and something that I do not have a name for but that has always meant, to some part of me that operates below language, that I was somewhere I was supposed to be. I said, I'm sorry I was gone so long. She looked at me steadily. She said, I accept that given the circumstances, the durations was not fully within your control. I said, no. She said, I also accept that the duration was extremely long, and I would prefer it did not happen again. I said, agreed. She said, you should know that I intend to have a formal inquiry conducted into the labor compound network at Drevet 6 and the surrounding moons. I began the preliminary investigation 8 days ago when the caseworker's report reached the outer court. I said, you started an inquiry before I arrived. She said, the 40 other people in irregular contracts at that compound also deserve to not be there. I was not waiting. I looked at her for a moment, 10 years and 6 of them absent. And she was still the clearest-eyed person I had ever known. Not warm in the way the word is usually meant, not demonstrative, not given to easy expressions of feeling, but clear, seat, consistent. The kind of person who, when they believe something, believes it all the way to its practical consequences, including the consequences that have nothing to do with their own situation. She had started the inquiry for 40 strangers before I even arrived. Because it was the correct thing. I said, I'm home. It was not a declaration, it was not a speech. It was the same kind of plainness as hello, Sarah. Just the simplest true thing. Said to the room and to her, and to the particular quality of light on the dark green stone floor. She said, yes. She took her hand from my jaw. She did not step back. She stood there, in the formal distance of the inner bay, in the deep green dress. with a copper house mark at the collar, and she looked at me the way she had looked at me in the outer court on that cold morning long ago, with the assessment of someone who has decided something and is confirming it. She said, "Your room is as you left it. I kept the books on your side of the shelf in the order you had them. I moved the astronomy charts from the corridor study to the main study when the light was better there in winter, but I can move them back." I said, "Leave them where the light is better," she said. "I thought you might say that." I said, "The Velsoth," she said, "Sothrin has already spoken to the kitchen. It will be ready in your room by the time the medic finishes," I said. "You've been planning," she said, "for 6 years and 4 months, more or less." That was when I understood fully, not as an idea, but as a solid and present reality, what she had actually done. Not the refusals, not the political battles, not the holding of the council at arm's length through 5 requests and 3 years of formal pressure. All of that was extraordinary, but it was external. It was the thing other people could see and recount and analyze. What I was understanding now was the interior of it. That every day for 6 years and 4 months she had kept the astronomy charts in the wrong corridor because she was keeping them for the better light she was not yet getting. And she had kept the books in my order on my side of the shelf. And she had kept my name on the living rolls not as a political act and not as denial, but as the most literal possible expression of the thing she believed, which was that I was coming back. She had not known when. She had not known how. She had not known. And this is the part I have never been able to entirely settle in my mind without a specific quality of stillness coming over me. She had not known that I was capable of coming back, because she did not know what had happened to me or where I was for most of those years. She had only the absence of a body and the absence of certainty, which is not the same as evidence of survival. She had held not a fact but a direction for 6 years and 4 months. And she had held it against considerable pressure, with considerable practical consequences. And she had been right. "Sira." She said, "Yes?" I said, "Thank you for not lighting the fire." She was quiet for a moment. The blue-white light came through the high windows and fell on her pale gold skin and the copper threads at her collar and the gray eyes that were still bright, still holding what they were holding, still not overflowing. She said, "There was never any question of lighting the fire." I said, "No." She said, "You should see the medic." I said, "In a minute." She looked at me. Shh. I looked at her. The inner bay was very still around us, and the court staff was very correctly not looking, and Velsothrin was doing something involving the far door that was entirely not watching us, and the household guard was doing what household guard do, which is being present and invisible simultaneously. I thought about the morning we had first stood in the outer court, the one I had been remembering on the observation deck of the Sorel kind. Cold morning, the early light, telling me that she had not made this decision without understanding what it would cost, and she did not regret the cost. There had been something in that conversation I had been too close to, at the time, to fully understand. I had understood it as a statement of commitment, which it was, but it was also something else. It was a description of how she worked. A woman who takes inventory of the cost before she decides, and when the accounting is done, does not revisit it, does not second guess, does not. 6 years and 4 months later, look at the evidence and conclude that the cost has exceeded the expectation, and the decision was therefore wrong. She had calculated the cost of keeping my name on the living rolls. She had calculated the council opposition, the succession pressure, the formal proposals, and the informal pressure, and the very gray afternoon with Seth Halal and the court secretary. She had calculated the cost of every refusal, and she had refused anyway because, when she does the accounting, she does it fully. And when the accounting tells her what is true, she does not argue with it, even when what it tells her is something she cannot prove to anyone else. I had spent 6 years thinking of her as the person I was getting back to. I understood now that she had spent 6 years thinking of me as the person who was coming back. Not hoping, not enduring, waiting, in the way of absolute practical certainty, in the way of someone who has set out a chair at a table because the person who fills it will eventually arrive. That is a specific kind of love. I do not have better language for it than that. It is the kind that does not require demonstration. because it expresses itself entirely in action, and the action is, I kept your name on the rolls, I kept the books in your order, I moved the charts to where the light is better, and I waited. I reached out and took her hand, her right hand, properly, the way you take a Nalith Queen's hand, in formal acknowledgement, which is also the way I had always taken her hand, because the formal and the personal had always been the same gesture for us. And I held it. She let me. That was the recognition. Not a declaration, not a crowd, not a room full of witnesses learning his name or a court learning her worth. Just that. I held her hand, and she let me, and outside the high windows, Nalith Prime's cool blue-white light went on falling through the glass the way it had always fallen, on all the days I had not been there to see it. The astronomy charts were in the main study, where the light was better. The Velsoth was in the kitchen, waiting. My name was on the living rolls. She had kept everything as it was, for 6 years and 4 months, because she knew what was true, and now I was here and it was.